Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series, and we're not doing a diary today. We're in 1939, continuing on with actually 1938, the Candide Interview of 28th December 1938. That wasn't the day it happened, that was the day that it was published in Candide. The day when you could go to the store and buy it. And it's a sensitive one. It's a sensitive one. The topic today will be Ukraine, and Dmitri had very typical great Russian views on Ukraine. So, the situation back then in 1938 was similar in some ways, but also very different, of course, from what's going on now in 2025. But anyway, we'll talk about all of that on the other side. I like Dmitri very much. I want all of you to like him. You don't have to, but that's something that would make me happy for what it's worth. But I also want you to know him, and knowing him is more important than liking him. And that's my challenge as a novelist, I guess. You can't really succeed with a book if you have a main character, a viewpoint character, who's not likable. I'm sure you could come up with instances where that's the case, but that's my challenge as a novelist. He very often is likable, very often. But in this instance, if we judge by modern standards, no, anyway, I'm babbling. That's quite apparent. So let's do our recap. When the previous video, we were in 1915, and Ella had asked Dmitri to pray for her sister, probably Victoria of Battenberg, maybe Alex, not sure. And he'd had a quick meetup with Brasova and then gone to the ballet. So our previous 1939, we just had Dmitri sort of making a statement about where he stood in relation to Russia and his patriotism. And he even, went so far as to lie a lot, in order to emphasize just how patriotic he was, that he would never have taken up arms against Russians, not even Bolsheviks, and that he was fighting against the Turks. But when his British commander told him, now you're going to fight against the Bolsheviks, he said, no, I won't do that. I wonder how he saw that in the context of the Russian Civil War, when it was Russian against Russian. I guess a civil war is a different thing. It's not being out on the battlefield against a foe, and he would have been he would have been fighting for and representing Britain. So yeah, I do see the difference there. So our cast today, we have the only person mentioned by name is Stalin. So here we go. Our last section here, he had, what did he last say? Well, he finished his patriotic statement, and yeah, that's right. Fayard said that he could sympathize with this idea that, you can't fight against your own country, and that the people who had, after the French Revolution, had gone into France, the emigres who had left the country and then came back with Brunswick, that they were never really forgiven. Okay, and then Dmitri starts up again. So this is him talking. It is not, moreover, exclusively a sentimental issue. I believe that political common sense leads to the same conclusion. Everything suggests that the communist regime will soon collapse in shame and impotence, though it's difficult to assign a precise end to it. At that point, Russia will have to be rebuilt. Restoration is likely, provided that the hands of the Romanovs are clean of Russian blood. Just imagine what an immense task we will then have. What state will we find our country in after more than 20 years of the Soviet regime? I don't really know. And so many problems that will have to be approached with an open mind. exclamation point. Obviously, there can be no question of pretending that everything that happened didn't happen and returning everything to the way it was in 1914. We should not even think about revenge. Revenge is not a political sentiment, and anyway, Stalin himself has already executed most of our executioners. But it will probably be necessary to create a federal empire, a formula which is in no way contradictory. The English Empire, with its totally independent dominions, is it not a federative empire? The Ukraine will then have all the freedom she asks for. She will have her own language, since she insists on it, and since the USSR has already granted it to her. Then Fayard asks, is there in fact a true Ukrainian language? Dmitri responds, no. To be fair, it's more a dialect, a mixture of Russian and Polish, but that's not important. On the contrary, even if the adventure succeeded, it would mean that we reconquered the Ukraine only with the help of German bayonets, and the foundational patriotism of the Russian people would then crystallize against us and embrace the Soviets, who would gain a new prestige. Because we must not hide the fact that we've seen this phenomenon play out in many countries. The first revolutionary wave is anti-patriotic. It destroys all national values. But the second is patriotic and strives to rebuild national values as best it can. Thus, we would destroy forever our hope of returning to Russia by limiting ourselves to the crown of a province, well populated and so fertile, but a simple border province. In Russian, Ukraina means frontier or border province. Okay, so that's that. Whew. Not quite as bad as the first time I read it, and I thought, oh no, it's not really that well, it's insulting to Ukrainians, so I shouldn't say it's not that bad, but he's not being antisocial or anything. Okay, I will say that having now read from 1906 to 1940, not in unbroken succession, but his writings for that whole period, that I detect a bit of a hardening at this time that you just didn't have, even in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. And, he's kind of less kind than he was, even when he was under great duress. He's kind of, there's a kind of more of this cynicism and hardness. And now when I think about what Grunwald said about Dmitri not being willing to help his sister, and what Dmitri wrote himself, what Maria wrote herself in her diary about having been really disillusioned about Dmitri, that he was the person she thought he was. I think that's happening. And the funny thing is that it's going to unhappen, so to speak, because when we have him at Schatzalp, he's going to go back to being a really kind and warm-hearted person. And it's interesting, isn't it? He was already sick in January, or rather December 1939, and maybe that contributed. Maybe it hadn't been diagnosed yet and he didn't know what was going on with him. But I'm not even talking about specifically in relation to this interview, but he's just a little sterner and sort of, I don't know, maybe it was just this one interview that he just didn't have his usual kind of sense of humor. But well, you can make up your own minds. Anyway, this is interesting when he writes, everything suggests that the Soviet system is about to fall. So what is everything? What is everything? I'm going to have to take a look at that, because he's putting it forth as this is just political common sense, that the Soviet Union is on the verge of collapse. And really, I don't know what he's responding to in relation to that. As I've said before, Dmitri was very much on top of current events, so I'll put a question mark by that one. And now, I'll put my Freudian hat on, my psychoanalyst hat on, and say, aha, he's talking about the shame and impotence of the Soviets. different tune from what he'd been singing not that long ago about how the Soviets had created this mighty state. But, is there a little of the personal when he's talking about shame and impotence? Obviously not talking about, sexual impotence, but powerlessness. And are those feelings that he has? Shame about, I don't know, how he spent his life and not really done anything for Russia. I don't know if he saw it that way. Or, is it more collective? Is he saying is there this subtext that when he says the Soviet system is going to collapse in shame and impotence, was that sort of the feeling within the Russian imperial family? Because he talked about before, if you remember, right off the bat with Fayard, he talked about how nobody took them seriously and they were just sort of forgotten. So maybe that was something that he was projecting onto the family, or that that was genuine within the family. Maybe it was also about the Russian immigration. Here big things were happening in the world, and kind of people were fighting over them a little bit. The Nazis wanted them, the British wanted them to behave themselves and not ruin this prospective treaty with Russia. So, I would guess that, that the entire emigration / the Romanovs / Dmitri himself had this sense of shame and impotence, and maybe even collapse. Maybe even that, well, Cyril has died and Vladimir is kind of a non-starter. And so that's speculation on my part, but I think it's interesting. Restoration is likely. So not only is the Soviet Union on the verge of collapse, but when it does collapse, the restoration of the Romanov dynasty is likely. Really? That's another question mark. What makes him think that? As part of this hardening that I'm referring to, I won't say that it's necessarily hardening in relation to other people, that's the extent of it. It seems like there's also sort of now a turning away from what he knows and what he's acknowledged many times in the past. He's acknowledged that, this just isn't going to happen. And now he's saying it's likely. And I'm trying to remember if in the one letter to Maria that he wrote in September, the letters he wrote in September and October 1939, if it seems like he was chiding her for thinking that, the Soviets were going to step aside and the monarchy was going to be restored. It seems like he was saying, you're being completely unrealistic. I need to reread that. Maybe it's more fresh in your minds than in mine. Maybe if you have better memories than me. Okay, and again, putting on my psychoanalyst hat, no blood on the hands. So the Romanovs will be restored to the throne in all likelihood as long as they have no blood on their hands. So, on the surface, he's saying we are not going to help the Germans go in and take over Ukraine. But beneath the surface, that was an expression of his in all of his writings. When Rasputin comes up, no matter in what aspect, I have no blood on my hands. I have no blood on my hands. I told my father I have no blood on my hands. So that is there in his brain, that whole idea. And it's interesting that he uses it now in this context. And it does seem that there's a lot of this, the shame and impotence, the no blood on my hands, that there's a lot of this that is personal. Okay, it sheds light on what Grunwald was writing to Maria when he said that Vladimir was doing everything possible to ensure that the Romanovs would not be able to return to Russia. And, so, okay, that's a little clearer then. If Vladimir not only accepts the puppet kingship of Ukraine, but actually encourages Russians to go and fight alongside the Germans in taking over Ukraine, well, the Romanos are then never going to be accepted back. Okay, the open mind, This has been absolutely consistent with Dmitri all along. We are not going to be returning to the past. We're not going to go back to the status quo before the war started. We're going to have to incorporate some of the ideas of the Soviets, and so we have to have an open mind. So as I say, completely consistent with him. Reference to the purges, the Stalinist purges, that's interesting. Most of our executioners have already been executed. Okay, this idea of a federal empire, well, he's talking about the Commonwealth. Britain still was an empire, but yeah, basically a federal empire means a commonwealth, right? At this point in time, and certainly after the Second World War. So Ukraine is part of a commonwealth. Yeah, that's not a bad idea, is it? I mean, if Putin wasn't around, and yeah, there could be a Russian Commonwealth. That would be nice. Yeah, Ukraine could be an independent state within the Commonwealth, as with the European Union, for instance. But maybe I'm putting my foot in it there. That would have to be something that everybody agreed with, but it's not. Dmitri saying this, he's not being at all unreasonable. The problem is then what he goes on to be so sort of dismissive. Well, those Ukrainians, they want certain freedoms, fine, they can have anything they want, they can have the freedoms they want. The Ukrainian language, Fayard had to go there, of course. Oh no, it's just a dialect. Well, that's completely untrue. So, I have several Russian friends who, here in the U.S., who in sympathy for the Ukrainians have almost immediately started studying Ukrainian, the language. And my friend and client Olga, she was kind of disgruntled the other day because she was with a group of friends and they were speaking Ukrainian and she couldn't understand. So I understand that, but if you think that it's just, a slight difference and any Russian can understand Ukrainian, no, Dmitri is wrong about that. He's simply wrong about that. And I don't know if, he has any experience of hearing spoken Ukrainian or, he could have, there were dialects. The Cossacks had a dialect. There were various dialects, and he might have heard a dialect within the Ukrainian language and thought, okay, this is what Ukrainians speak. I don't know how on top of that he was. Okay, interesting. This statement about the first and second revolutions. I have to think about that. He speaks about historical. He references it as a historical phenomenon that the first revolution in a country is anti-patriotic. He says certainly in Russia it was ostensibly international. It was to spread communism internationally. And destroys all national values, but he says the second revolution is patriotic and strives to rebuild national values. So, I mean, you could kind of, well, in an offensive way, but you could kind of say, okay, the Weimar Revolution was more, maybe that's just what he means, more open, more not wanting to be isolationist and nationalistic. And then, of course, the Nazism was all about nationalism, well, among other things. So, yeah, that's interesting. I have to take a look at some other situations and see if that holds true. And I wonder if, I wonder on what basis he had that idea. Wish I could ask him that. All right. Now here's the real sticking point. Oh, Ukraine, it's just a province. It's just a province, Okay, even if we were the kind of bad people who would invade a part of our own country, as he sees it, with German help, and gain the crown there, who cares? You would just be the king of a province. Well, no. No, Ukraine is not a province. It was never a province. Ukraine, as he says, does indeed mean at the border or on the border, the borderlands, the frontier. So, but you know, if you know your Russian history, you know that Kievan Rus, as the seat of the monarchs, came before Moscow. But anyway, I'm just digging myself deeper into a hole and stepping on people's feet. So I'm going to stop now. I'm probably not any better than Dmitri as far as these things go. What do we have next time? 1939. More about what Dmitri thinks about Stalin and what Stalin stands for and what the Russian people want and what the nature of their patriotism is. So again, very interesting. 1915, he will be on the prowl, my friends. So come back for all of that, and I'll see you then. Bye.